Okay, now it's official. Now we're recording. So thanks for coming, everybody. It was going to be, I wasn't sure how many we'd get to attend these live sessions. So I may have somebody come in. If it gets chaotic, my thought was if we got a bunch of people, I would just have everybody muted and you could type in your questions and I would have somebody relay those to me as I was painting. But it looks like if we don't have too many attending this live part of it, you can just kind of shout them out. So the idea here is to kind of take you through the whole process of how I make a painting. And I'm going to try to do two actually. And the reason I decided to try to do that is to just talk my way through the generation of an idea and then how I can slowly tweak that idea to make something, completely unique, but kind of within that same vein of thought. A lot of times in my past, if I made a painting, let's say of a seascape, I would always avoid turning around and making another seascape immediately because I felt like I didn't want to be too self-regurgitative. And so then I'd turn around and do maybe a floral scene or a nude painting or whatever. And I felt like, I guess in terms of creativity, I felt like I wanted to kind of allow myself to explore more broad subjects because I was genuinely interested in a wide range of things. In terms of branding, that doesn't help at all because I think it's easier, if you're really concerned about branding, to be maybe consistent. If you do the same kind of painting over and over and over, people get to know like what you're about. It's too boring for me. I can't do that. I couldn't ever do that. But I mean, if you want it, from my observation, the quickest way to define yourself, stick to one subject matter, if you can stand it. But ultimately that wasn't really what motivated me. So anyways, but then I realized as I kind of get a little bit older that there's certain themes that I remain interested in. And so I've sort of shed this false concept of self-regurgitation, and I've tried to open up a new freedom to make paintings that maybe feel a little bit similar, but are unique in themselves. So the jumping off point is going to be a painting I made a few years ago. It's something that it's a theme I just keep mentally coming back to, wanting to try something, play with that theme a little bit more. And it's a little bit more tonalistic, a lot more compressed values, simple in terms of composition, but really poetic in the general idea. So that's the jumping off point, and I'll get into that. I'll show you some images and talk through the process here in a second. I should ask before we start, is there any questions before we really dive into this?
No.
No? I'll just keep talking then. Okay. If you guys don't interrupt me, I will just keep blabbing. So if you do have questions, just feel free to, especially when I start turning around and painting and whatever, I'm not going to be able to see you raise a hand or something. So just I'll have this volume up just to make sure I can hear you. Okay. All right. So let's start with materials. We'll go through that as quickly as possible. Typically I'm working, let's start with surfaces. I'm working on panels. and I usually make these myself. Uh, I use either like a Baltic birch, um, and maybe I have like Clausen's 13. I like the single primed number 13. It's a finer weave linen. I like the single primed because I think the way that they put the primer on or apply the primer is with a spray. At least that's what it looks like. And the single prime gives me more of the linen texture, whereas a double prime, I feel like I get more of that sort of spattered spray look of the primer. So if I am using a pre-primed linen, typically it's Clausen's 13. I've used a number of others. I think that's just a matter of, whatever feels good to you. Whether that's some people like a rougher texture, some people like a finer texture. There's much finer texture than Clausen's 13 as well that you can find. But Clausen's 13 is widely available, and you can get a big roll of it and cut it to whatever size you want. I apply my linen to the board with a Beva glue, which is spelled Beva. You can get that in rolls. It comes in. Has anyone not heard of Beva glue?
Me.
Okay. So if you're not familiar with it, it's a heat activated glue. And the reason I like it, the reason a lot of our archivists are using it now as well. A lot of art restorers are using it. It's because it's reversible, and it activates at a very low temperature. So if you have a painting that you've already done that you want to mount, and the reason for mounting a painting is if anyone has heard of George O'Hanlon, he's the head of Natural Pigments. And he's just a materials genius. So his advice is, if you want to, the most important thing you can do for the longevity of a painting is work on a rigid substrate. And what that means is a mounted canvas. And you don't even have to work on a mounted canvas. I have another one here that is ACM. That just means aluminum composite material. And what that is, you're not going to be able to see this very well, but you have an aluminum side. Sometimes it's coated on both sides with a white coating, but it's a very thin piece of aluminum, two very thin pieces of aluminum sandwiching a hard plastic in the middle. And it's thin, as you can see, so it's lightweight. And you can paint directly on that surface. When you get it from the manufacturer, it's really easy. You can score it with a razor blade and just cut it to whatever size you want. You can get it in 4 by 8 foot sheets. It's lightweight. Again, it doesn't warp, which is nice. Of course, if you dent it, that sucks. But you can paint directly on that plastic surface that it comes with. If you sand it up a little bit, you don't want to sand it to where it goes through that plastic surface to the aluminum, but that's a surface you could paint directly onto, and it's perfectly archival. With this one that I'm going to paint on, I put a coat of lead white on it first, because it's a very, very slick surface. So when you start painting on it, like I wouldn't probably do alla prima, like plein air stuff on this, because it's being a really slick surface, the paint tends to cut through quite a bit. So I only work on this if I'm planning on working in layers, because you get that paint on the surface, and then painting on paint is really nice. That has a really nice feel. And it doesn't tend to cut through as much if you already have paint. So that's why I painted this whole surface with a lead white first. So this is already dried, and I'll use that as a painting surface. Otherwise, I use I attach linen to these different surfaces. I can attach linen to the ACM panel with the Beva glue. It's a little bit more difficult to attach to the ACM, again, because it's such a slick surface. The easiest thing to attach it to is birch. But if you're getting into bigger sizes, birch can be heavy. And so you may not want to use that. But also birch warps a little bit more because it is a plywood. Another surface you can use is gator board, if you've heard of that. Anyone not heard of gator board?
No, I know what gator board is.
Okay. It's like a firm foam core. That, like this, is mounted on gator board. It's a lot lighter. And so for like a big painting like that, gator board can be nice. And then this is linen mounted to it with the Biva glue.
But Ryan, you said that the Biva glue is heat activated.
It's heat activated.
So
So
what do? You use an iron? You use
yeah, so that's what I was just going to get into.
Oh, sorry.
I'll try not to get too tangential here, just stick to the basics, but the best thing you can use is a dry mount heat press. You can find those on eBay sometimes. They're heavy. They're big. They come in all different sizes, from like a 12 by 16 to you could get a 4 foot by 8 foot, massive one, and mount whole huge panels. But the reason those are the best is because you can put it in, pull the top down, and you can set the temperature at like 150 degrees. And then it's just even. You're not getting hotter than that. It's a very even temperature. The Biva glue, it comes in, you could get it in liquid form, but I wouldn't mess with that because it's kind of messy. What I get it is in rolls. And so the Biva glue itself is in sheets, and you cut the sheets like paper to whatever size that you want. It's sandwiched between, it's very thin film of dry glue, sandwiched by, on one side, wax paper, and on the other side like a clear acetate. So what you do is you peel that acetate off, you put the glue side down onto the panel, the wood panel or whatever, and then you either put that in the dry mount heat press for 10 seconds, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. You peel the wax side off, and then you put the acetate down. So the acetate is between the heat source, whether that's a hand iron or the dry mount heat press, and the glue side is on the panel. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so then you have that there for maybe 10 seconds. The glue activates. You peel the acetate off carefully. Then you just have glue, and then you can put your linen down and put that back into the dry mount heat press for maybe 30 seconds to a minute. You don't want to leave it in too long, because the longer that the glue is activated, the more it will tend to soak into the back of the linen, and then you may not have enough glue left to really attach, and then you get bubbles. So 30 seconds to a minute is enough. And then what I do is I have like just a rag or something, and when I pull it out, as the glue cools, it obviously solidifies. So I just take that rag and I rub it across the surface just to keep that flat as it dries. Maybe for again another 10-15 seconds. So here's the difference in a dry mount heat press versus a hand iron. The hand iron, I think at its lowest temperature, is like 220 degrees. It's much hotter, and you can't set the temperature on a hand iron. So the reason that that's problematic is because, again, it's melting the glue too quickly and too much. So with a hand iron, if you're going across a surface and you hold it in one spot too long, you're going to liquefy that glue too much. It's going to melt into the back of the canvas, and once it dries, you're going to have a little bit of a bubble, which you can't really fix. That then you have to heat the rest of this thing, peel it back off, put more glue down, and reattach it. So a hand iron, I would practice with smaller panels first. And a hand iron, typically, like I rub it back and forth. And also the other thing to think about is if you're using linen, like a pre-primed linen, obviously the primer side's up. You need a buffer between the linen and the hand iron. Otherwise, the hand iron's going to scorch that surface, and you're going to have all these black spots on the canvas. So either what I have is just like a thin towel, not a bath towel. That's a little too thick, but like a thin piece, maybe like an extra piece of raw linen or something, or a t-shirt or whatever, something thin. And kind of rub that back and forth in a small, maybe 5-inch area for about 15 seconds. Take that off, take the other rag, and as it cools, rub that flat, and then move to the next section and do that same thing. And so if you practice on a small one, you can get pretty adept at it, and then you can use a hand iron to do larger ones. You can also mount raw linen this way. The raw linen I just mount, and there's a whole nother process of preparing the raw linen I can tell you about if you want to take the time. But that's the best thing to use. There's the Biva glue, and get your whatever you're working on. Try to do it on a rigid substrate. It protects the painting. It safeguards it from moisture coming into the back. Working on a rigid surface is the best protection you can have for painting. Does anybody have any questions on that? Yeah.
I have a I understand what you're saying, and I have a comment that most or a lot of framers have those heat things, you know, that you're talking about. And it happened to me that I had 3 panels that I had tried to glue onto a rigid substrate. There were bubbles everywhere, and I didn't know what to do, so I took it to the framer, and in 5 minutes he had fixed it with the glue because it had reactivated, right? So
Yeah.
that's just a hint. If you don't want to spend hundreds of dollars, just find a framer who can do it in 5 minutes.
Yeah, if they're familiar with the
And
thing and have the
they've got
equipment.
big beds too. They've got the bigger beds rather than just smaller ones, right?
Yeah, I mean, certainly not all framers have that equipment, but if you can find somebody that does, that's great. The last thing I just remembered, I omitted one bit of information about these rigid substrates. The three things that I have used, 4 things that I have used to mount to are the ACM, which is the aluminum composite panels. I've used the birch plywood. I have used MDF. I don't suggest MDF just because it's not as archival a material. It warps a lot more. It's heavier, whatever, more susceptible to moisture. But for like small things like 6x8, small panels, I might use MDF just because it's a little cheaper. And then the last thing is gator board. So here's the difference when you're mounting with Biva, because this is important. ACM and gator board, because they're aluminum and then basically kind of cardboard foam, they retain heat like crazy. The gator board is the worst. So when it gets hot, it stays hot longer. So if you're going to mount with a hand iron to gator board, you want to have that hand iron on the gator board for less time, because it will, it's just going to absorb that heat and hold on to it. And again, the hotter it is, the longer it's hot, the more inclined that Biva glue will be to soak into the linen, and then you don't have enough glue left over to really keep it adhered. So the gator board is very fickle that way. If you're doing Gator board and you have access to a dry mount heat press, that's much better because it's, again, just an even heat. If you are using a hand iron, just you really need to be careful about the amount of time you hold that hand iron on the Gator board. And the same with the ACM panel, because it absorbs heat. You have to be much more careful about how long that you keep the heat on it. The wood cools down really fast, so you can hold the heat on there a little bit more, and once you take it off, it cools down really quickly. So a hand iron, I would try to do more with the wood if you can. Yes, Sylvia.
What is the optimum temperature for the hand iron?
Well, I mean, the lowest.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I think the lowest typically on most hand irons is around 200, 220 degrees.
Okay.
But really the optimal for the Biba glue is 150. There's just, I don't know a hand iron that you can get that does it that low. So you just have to time it more. You just have to have less time if you're using a hand iron.
That's Fahrenheit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
All right. So that's surfaces. These other materials we can go through pretty quickly. I use typically 4 brands of paint. Gamblin, I like Michael Harding. Rublev is from Natural Pigments, and Old Holland. So, you know, there's more great brands, but those are the ones I typically stick to. I like their consistency. I like specific colors in specific brands. As far as mediums go, again, one of the things that George O'Hanlon said is it's hard to really know with a lot of the new mediums and paints and manufactured colors that we have. It's hard to know what their longevity will be or how time will affect them, because we don't have the benefit of time to judge them by. So, you know, in his words, the best mediums you can use are the simplest, or the best, you know, formulas for mediums are the simplest. The ones that are the most time tested are obviously linseed oil, maybe safflower oil, walnut oil. And so if you can, I know there's a lot of fancy concoctions out there for mediums, but for me, I just use linseed oil pretty well. I mean, sometimes walnut oil. Linseed oil is a little bit faster dryer. Walnut oil is a slower dryer. So if you want to extend the drying time, maybe use walnut oil. Also, walnut oil tends to yellow slightly less over time than linseed oil. So these are all just things to take into account. I also use Rublev's Lead White, #1. The #1 is mixed with linseed oil. The Rublev #2 Lead White is mixed with walnut oil. I like the Lead White #1 because it dries a lot faster. It's typically going to be dry by the next day. And for my working process, what I'm, you know, like the most is to have a dry surface when I come in to paint the next day. So you can get just a bottle of linseed oil, just refined linseed oil that you can use, or I use this oleo gel, which is basically just linseed oil, but it's mixed with fumed silica, which is a completely inert substance. So it doesn't have any effect on anything except it makes the linseed oil a gel. So it's nice because you can put it out on a handheld palette or something, or especially plein air painting when you don't want liquid running everywhere. I take this and it squeezes out on the palette like a paint and stays there because it's in gel form. So oleo gel or straight linseed oil, that's typically what I'm using for mediums. The only other thing I use for mediums is what I use when I'm oiling out. And I'll try, to keep this brief and not too technical. So Rublev makes this medium number 1, and comes in this bottle. And what this is a vacuum-bodied linseed oil and spike oil, which is lavender oil. Lavender oil is, or oil of spike, same thing. It is a very strong solvent. So you probably use odorless mineral spirits to clean your brushes or to thin your paint in early layers or whatever. That's a solvent. It's a pretty strong solvent. Spike oil is a much stronger solvent. So like if you had a painting that was maybe a week old or whatever, and you didn't like an area, you could take some spike oil and rub it on the surface, and it would start to take that paint off. So it's a strong solvent. So here's why this is such a great oiling out thing. Vacuum bodied linseed oil is a manufactured way of making stand oil. Stand oil is, or sun thickened linseed oil, it's all the same. It's usually the old way of doing it is to take a big vat of linseed oil and put it out in the sun for 3 months and let it thicken. So the process, oil paintings don't dry, they oxidize. And that's a process that continues for the life of the painting. So what you're getting in a stand oil or sun thickened linseed oil is that process of oxidation is happening. And so it's making that more and more viscous, more thick and sort of honey-like. And vacuum bodied linseed oil is just doing that through a heat vacuum process, and they get to, same thing, it oxidizes it much faster. But it's basically the same thing. So what this is half vacuum bodied linseed oil and half spike oil. The reason that that's important is because when you use a vacuum bodied oil, because it has already oxidized quite a bit, it tends to sink in less. So you could use this as like a little medium if you wanted. I would be very reserved with how much you use of it if you are using it. And here's why. I did a painting that I needed to finish quickly, and it had a lot of dark areas. And I didn't know this beforehand. I found out the hard way. But I wanted the dark areas in paintings tend to dry a little bit slower, right? The blacks and the brown I use is asphaltum. The ultramarine blue deep that I use, all those colors tend to dry much slower, and I needed them to dry pretty quickly. So I was using quite a bit of this vacuum bodied of this medium. And what I didn't realize is that if you use too much, it can cause later in the painting what they call blooming. And what that means, and I don't know exactly the science behind this, but what it does is in those really dark areas, they start to get this sort of milky film on them. You can wipe it off, but it continues to happen. So, I had this collector that bought the painting that I made, and like 5-6 months later, he called and, sent me this picture, and he's like, "What's going on here?" And I went, I called George in a frantic terror and asked what was happening. And he said, you can clean that off, but it comes from the overuse of too much oxidized oil. So if you are going to use this, I would just use it somewhat sparingly. And I don't use it as a medium, directly in my painting process anymore, but I do use it as a oiling out medium. Again, here's why, and here's how I use it. So I have, this is almost gone, but I'll have maybe, I don't know, a quarter of this filled with the actual medium itself, which again is 50-50. It's 50 oil and 50 spike oil, which is a strong solvent. So if I apply this directly, I only have 50% of that mixture is oil, which is important because obviously we want to follow that fat over lean concept. And if I'm oiling out a certain area, let's say, let me just put this painting up. See that? Okay. So in this painting, you have like really light areas, and then you have these dark areas, right? The way that, or the areas that they typically sink in the most is in the dark areas. That's where you're going to notice sinking in the most. So let's say I wanted to work on this portrait and the hair around it had sunk in. Well, I know I'm not going to paint into the hair. But I do need to see the correct value and color of the hair so that I can bounce that off of the portrait, whatever work I'm going to do in the portrait. I would want to oil that out before I started the painting, but I'm not going to paint into it. So what I don't want to do is put a thick layer of oil down and then have that dry, right? Because now I have a straight fat layer that once it's dry and I come back to and want to paint on is going to potentially cause problems down the road. So the best thing to do if you're oiling out is to only oil out in the areas you're going to immediately paint into. That isn't the way painting works, though. That's not always going to be the case. There is sometimes areas that you just have to see what they really look like to paint the thing next to it. Does that make sense? And you know you're not going to have time to paint directly into that area. So what I do is I have this bottle, and I would use, if I am going to paint directly into the area, let's say I'm going to work, the eyes into the nose, I can take this straight out of the bottle and do a very thin layer over that area and then paint right into it, because that paint is going to obviously attach to that oiling out, and then it's not a fat layer because it fuses with that new paint I just added to it. Is this all making sense so far?
Yes.
Okay. So if I am oiling out an area that I'm not going to be painting into, then what I do is I have a second bottle of this that is half of the original that I get from George, and then I fill it another half with mineral spirits, and I shake that up really well. So now I only have 25% of this mixture is oil, and 75% is solvent. Does that make sense? So when I oil out, say, the hair, and I'm not going to paint into it, the solvent will evaporate, and then I'm left with this tiny bit of oil. And so even if that dries and I go back and paint over it, it's not going to be problematic later. And the reason I use this to oil out rather than, say, just like a linseed oil mixed with mineral spirits or something is because it's already oxidized. When that dries in those dark areas, it's not going to sink in as it dries. But if I were to use straight like linseed oil mixed with mineral spirits, as that dries, it does tend to sink in again, and then I have to oil it out again a second time. Does that make sense? Okay. So yeah, those are the two ways I use this. One to oil out in areas I'm going to paint directly into, and one to oil out in areas I'm not going to directly paint into. And those are basically all the mediums I use and how I use them. As for brushes, that's pretty basic. The brushes I use the most, I mean, almost exclusively nowadays is, well, actually, let me grab one more. All right. So typically I use 4 types of brushes. And really I only use two brands. I use Rosemary brushes and Trekell. And they're both great. And then they're both great people. I love working with both of them. So hog hair bristle, that's really, really nice. Let me grab one more. Let me grab two more. All right. So hog hair bristle are great. I typically will use those on larger paintings. You can fill that up with a lot of paint, but they take like the beading a lot better because they're natural hair. So a hog hair bristle like this, you know, I wouldn't typically use this if I were plein air painting because they are more stiff. And so they'll cut through the layers a little bit more. So I use this more in the studio, and I use it on early stages of the painting. And the reason for that is mostly the early stages in the painting. And you know, I can show this as I get into painting a little bit more. I'm scrubbing, you know, big areas down and trying to just cover the surface. And the reason that that's nice is this is how it wears down. It doesn't splay out or anything. It just sort of wears the hair down and retains its shape really nicely. So this is years old, and you can see this is brand new, how that hair wears down. So it takes a beating really nicely, and you can scrub a lot more with this, and it'll last longer through that scrubbing process. The other brush I typically use is this ivory, which is a synthetic hair. It's softer. I like the filbert shape, and I get them, a normal length would be about right there. But Rosemary sells an Egbert, which is an extra long, which is like twice this length. I don't like those. There's too much bounce to that. Or a long filbert is this length, and it's just like half as long extra as the original length. And I like that little bit more bounce to the brush. So I get the long filberts from Rosemary. And, you know, that's a beautiful brush, brand new. It's soft. You can be really delicate with it. You can paint wet into wet. But here's what happens when you scrub. It splays out at the end. It starts to lose that shape at the end here. And I've done some research. Rosemary sent it to a lab, and the lab said it's caused by mineral spirits. But that I don't want to dispute the real scientists, but I did my own research. I did like 6 months of testing. And what I think causes this the fastest is friction. And so like if you have really tacky paint, for instance, and you're trying to drag that across the surface, you know, you get these paints, maybe you keep them in the freezer, you know, and over the course of a week, it just gets more and more tacky, and you're too cheap or lazy to scrape it off and squeeze out some more. And so you're dealing with like really gunky, tacky paint. That will cause this. If you're dragging it across a really rough surface and you're scrubbing a little bit more with it, it's going to do this really fast. If you have a metal canister of mineral spirits with those little holes in the bottom, and you're scrubbing at the end of the day across those holes to clean off your brush, that's going to happen really fast. So it's not a total loss. You can't really do careful work with a brush like this, but once it does this, typically I just use it for scrubbing and messy stuff, or like textural stuff in like foreground grass or whatever. So they still have a lot of life to them. Their purpose changes a little bit. But being synthetic, they're also a little bit cheaper. So it's not the worst thing in the world when that happens. This is a mongoose hair. I only show you this to gloat because you can't get these anymore, and they're like the best brushes ever made. They outlawed mongoose. they're super soft, super nice. I use these maybe to like feather out certain areas to soften things. I used to use them a lot more directly, but since they outlawed them a decade ago, I've been a little bit more careful how I use them. The real reason I show you this is because with every artist I meet, I make a plea. If you know anybody in Hawaii that is a pest control guy, then tell me and put me in touch with them, because in Hawaii, it is legal to kill mongoose because they brought them over to take care of something, and then they, you know, bred and ran rampant. So they trap and kill them just as like a pest control thing. But they won't legally allow you to sell them because they don't want to create a market where people start breeding them. But if we can get a hold of a pest control guy and just like sort of under the table say, send me the tails, we could make a mint on making these brushes again. Okay, last one I use, and I'm not kidding about that. If you know a pest control guy, tell me. I might have made that sound like a joke, but I really want to get these mongoose tails. Okay, this is a golden tacklon. I typically get these from Trekell. I don't use tiny brushes like this a lot, but on small paintings, small portraits, maybe for like really fine detail in a foreground, or branches on a tree, on a small painting, or signing my name for sure. I get these little round golden tacklons from Trekell. They're synthetic, so they react the same way as these ivory brushes from Rosemary. After a little while and with some friction at the very end, they start to kind of splay. So the good thing is they're cheap, and so once they start to splay, you just get a bunch more. That's really all I use for brushes. Brush care, I use this Trekell linseed oil brush soap. It's made with linseed oil, so it tends to kind of treat the brush hair a little bit nicer, conditions them a little bit better. And the way I do it, and I think on my YouTube page, I actually have a brush care video that you can watch. So after this, you can hop on there. It's the Masters Academy of Art channel. Click like and subscribe, please. My podcast is also on there. There's some other materials, videos, and whatever if you wanted to check those out. But the linseed oil brush soap, at the end of the day, I rinse my brushes out in mineral spirits, wipe that off, try to get them as clean as possible. I've become a little bit more lazy, but I also paint every single day. So normally I'll put my paints and my brushes in the freezer for every night, and I try to wash my brushes once a week, which is a total lie. If I do it once a month, that's really good, but mentally I think I should at least clean them once a week. And so what I do after the mineral spirits, you just with warm water, get it on here. And one of the tricks William Whitaker taught me was, the first gunky layers, you just kind of work that out. Just get most of that gunk out under the water. And once it's pretty clean, do it one more time, get it soapy, and then grab the end of the hair and work it back and forth like that. And it's just going to pull out the leftover gunk from the ferrule. And as you're doing that, rinse it out. One thing that like will make these hog hair bristles or whatever splay from the bottom is that built up gunk that gets down into this metal ferrule. So that last thing is just work that back and forth and rinse that out, and then dry it off with a towel. And then I use also just a little bit of what's called Brush Restorer. And I believe this is 50% conditioner, hair conditioner, and 50% like cornstarch. This, you know, when you buy a brand new brush and it's a little stiff, that stuff that they put in it to keep it safe during shipping, yeah, it's 50% of this. So I just get a little dab of that, shape the brush, and lay it flat on a surface and let those dry overnight. And then it really lengthens the amount of time that you can use that brush. Keeps the shape really nice. And so that's the best way I've found to take care of your brushes. Any questions on any of that so far?
No, it's good.
Okay, this is we're trying to get the boring stuff out of the way as quickly as possible. Okay, so we've been through surfaces, mediums, paint. Oh, we haven't done the paints yet. I'll show you those here real quick. I think that's mostly everything. I'm going to switch to this. Make that. How do I do that? Try to make this the main one. Okay. So here's the paints. I laid them out just so you could see them and write them down, whatever. When it comes to oil colors, there's no right palette. So I don't want to pretend like you know, I have this magical palette. I've kind of just done what most artists do. I kind of took as a starting point some of the suggestions of teachers early on, and then refined it from there. Whatever, you know, colors that just reacted together in a way that was really appealing to me, or whatever. So typically on my palette, I try to have a warm and a cool of each color. So here I have, yeah, you can just see me point at this. Here I have the lead white #1. That's kind of the go-to absolute for everything. Cad yellow light, I don't always use it, but in these landscape paintings that I'm going to make, I am going to use a tiny bit of it. And so that would be the cool yellow. The warm yellow is this Blue Ridge yellow ochre, and that is just it's Rublev brand. It's a very rich yellow ochre. And then I use orange molybdate, which is like a Cad red light. If you use Cad red light, I like it better because it stays warmer when mixed with white, whereas Cad red light tends to cool down really quickly. It's a very strong color, so you don't need to use a ton of it. So I use that in everything. This color you can see right here, I think. So these are kind of laid out. That's orange molybdate. This is a genuine vermilion. I use that sometimes in backgrounds, mostly backgrounds now. Like I'm doing this painting. This is why I have it out, because I was working on, oh, can't see that. I was working on this. So all of this, like red background, I have a lot of vermilion in there. I used to suggest it to everybody, but it's like $120 a tube. So I don't know that you need it. Also, I noticed that it tends to dry much darker than it looks when it's light. So I was using it in flesh, but then like I'd come back after a month and this portrait that I felt like I'd painted really subtly was all of a sudden kind of splotchy. And I realized over time that it was the vermilion drying a little bit darker. So now typically in flesh, I only use this orange molybdate. And then I use alizarin crimson, either straight alizarin or this one's alizarin crimson permanent. Alizarin crimson is also supposed to get a little bit darker over time. So that's why I've kind of gravitated over to the alizarin permanent from Gamblin. So that'd be the cool red. My cool green is Viridian. I don't use this very often, but I am going to be painting some seascapes. And so I'm going to use a little bit of it in that. It's a great sort of cool green for seascapes. And then the sap green I use quite a bit. I like Gamblin sap green. Every single brand of sap green is different because sap green is a mixture color. It's you know, the companies are mixing two colors to get their sap greens. Some are darker, some are cooler, some are more opaque. I like the Gamblin sap green because it's more transparent, it's darker, and it leans more to the red than the blue. And I like the warmer, more transparent aspect of it. Then cobalt blue. This one is this Old Holland. Yeah. I typically am like Gamblin cobalt blue, old Michael Harding cobalt blue, Old Holland cobalt blue. They're all pretty consistent in their color. So I used all three of those back and forth. This is a color that I haven't done a lot of research, but I've only found in Old Holland, and it's ultramarine blue deep. Ultramarine, after a certain period of time, to me felt a little green, and just leaned a little bit more green than I liked. And then I tried this out. It's slightly darker than ultramarine blue, and it leans more to the purple, which to me is just more useful for whatever reason. I like that better. So I use this ultramarine blue deep, and then asphaltum. And the asphaltum is a mixture. It's like a red and a ivory black, but it creates this really transparent red leaning brown that I really like. And I don't use a black, even though, you know, this asphaltum contains black. What I get all my grays with are this combination of the ultramarine blue and the asphaltum. I can get a perfect black, like this is in the hair here. That's pretty black in areas, and that's just a combination of asphaltum and ultramarine blue. And that way I can control whether the black is cooler or warmer. And then the oleo gel. So I'm going to be using this handheld palette. I'm going to be painting right here. I have my original easel here. I recently moved out of my 5,500 square foot studio into this grand spare bedroom of like 80 square feet. So I don't have my big Hughes easel, which is like I miss it so much. It's in a storage unit. So I'll be working back here on this. And just to make it easier, I'm gonna use this handheld palette. These are from New Wave Art. They're amazing. And this palette here as well that you can see under the paint is New Wave Art as well. They make these tabletop square palettes. Really great craftsmanship. They put like a beautiful finish on it. I like the wood texture. You know, it just gets better over time if you take care of it. I don't have, as you can see, like this one, you can see over here is where I typically keep the paints. I'm not one of those guys that has those dried volcanoes on my palettes, because I just feel like these are like just really beautiful pieces of furniture. So I try to clean them off pretty regularly and take care of them, and then they'll last forever. So on this one, they put this like transparent gray finish on it, which makes it feel like, I don't know, just like a really rich cabinetry or something. Anyways, these are great because of how they're designed. The thumb hole is a little bit further away from your body, so you don't have to twist your wrist at all. It's in this perfect position. It's got these cutouts for your body, and it just sits here. You barely notice you're holding it. So best designed palettes you can find are from New Wave. I'm not getting paid to say that. That's just the truth. So check them out if you'd like. I've got the paints over here right now just because I'm going to mix a little bit bigger piles, and then I'll transfer that over here as we get into the painting process. So, but I wanted to be able to show how I'm mixing the paint, why I'm mixing it that way, before I transfer over and start to paint on the larger surfaces. Okay, I think that covers basically everything in terms of materials. Does anyone have any questions so far about anything?
No.
All right, so let's get into what I'm going to be painting. I'm going to try to, like I said, make 2 full paintings. We've got an hour and a half left today. I'm going to try to show you as much of the process as I can. I'm going to have to come up with some, I'll Google some jokes so I can have some filler stuff to say, because watching somebody paint can get pretty boring. But today, yesterday, I did, well, let me start with the idea. I'm going to do a screen share here. I think screen share, desktop, share. Okay. Oh, shoot. Okay. Sorry. I have to invite one more person. He paid through Venmo, but he just barely sent me his email. Sorry, let me do that real quick. How do I stop the share? Participants. Right. Sorry, guys. Oops. How do I do this? Invite. Okay, there we go. Okay. All right. So, okay. Let me do the screen share again. So this is the painting that I want to explore a little bit more. I did this a few years ago, and the idea basically is, I mean, I really love seascapes. My wife is from Southern California. I'm a landlocked boy. I grew up in Utah, but I spent a lot of time in junior high and high school in Hawaii, and just kind of, I mean, I guess anyone who spends time at the beach learns to love the beach, right? There's just a sort of magic to it. That infinity of space that you feel, the massiveness of the world when you stand at the edge of it and look out, and there's just you can see as far as you can see. It's pretty amazing. And then the light is so beautiful. If you know, seen Seascapes by Peter Croyer or William Trost Richards, Peter Monstead, you know, it's just, there's a beauty to it that you know, is unique to the subject matter. So what I wanted to do was, I'd done a bunch of sort of bright, sunset-y, you know, dramatic seascapes, and I wanted to see how compressed I could get with my color and my values. So I wanted to make a nocturne, but I wanted it to be higher key, and see if I could pull that off. And so that's really what this is about, is just trying to make more tonal painting, higher key, that still feels like a nocturne, and keep it really simple. And so here's what I think about when I think about painting. you're sort of a director, and you're choosing a certain narrative, a theme, whatever, and you're saying, because it's painting, I have one still image to encapsulate a larger idea. With film, obviously, you have the benefits of the dialogue, the interaction between characters, the movement, the setting, the lighting, the cinematography, the music. We don't necessarily have that in painting, but how do we make something that feels like it has all of that? And so that's a very difficult thing. You have to choose the exact right frame to tell a larger story. When it comes to balancing that, the way I think about it is every part of a painting is its importance is only relative to how it fits into the larger whole. Does it support the larger message, or is it overpainted and thereby it becomes selfish? And the hardest thing about painting is to the more information you put in a painting, the more difficult it is to balance all of that information into one overall statement, right? So if you have a bunch of information in a painting and some of it is overpainted, what it becomes like, and this is the way I sort of describe it. If you were doing a scene in a movie, right? And so welcome to these Tom and Beth, you guys just joined. Nice to see you. Sorry you missed a little bit of the first half, but it's being recorded. So we just got past the boring materials stuff. You can watch and fast forward through later. So I'm just starting to talk about the idea that I'm going to be painting. So again, all the parts of a painting should be subservient to this larger idea. So if you're filming a scene in a movie, and let's say the characters split up in the first act, and they're trying to figure out if they want to come back together, and so they meet. She agrees to meet him at a cafe in Paris, outdoors. It's in public. There can't be a big blow up. Safe place. So the scene is set, and it's this pivotal moment in the movie. And what I really want the audience's attention on is this intimate conversation between these people. A selfish part of a painting feels like the background actors 4 tables back are doing jumping jacks, right? It's incredibly distracting. And so as being the director of the painting, you have to have the cars driving by, you have to have the background actors, you have to set the scene for that narrative, but you have to paint every part of it in a way that keeps the attention where you want it. Does that make sense? And then one of the things that I've done in the past that I've kind of has been a sort of failing, I would say, of my paintings is I love information. I love to put, more and more information in a painting. This one is where I'm really trying to edit back and say more with less. But in my past, I've just dumped information in. So here's another concept that I try to share with as many people as I can, because I think it's important. There's this great movie called Genius, and it's about the author Tom Wolfe, and Colin Firth plays the editor in the movie, and Tom Wolfe is played by Jude Law. And so it's a really nice movie, but it's about this relationship between the editor and the writer, the genius of the writer and the genius of the editor, and how they work together to create works of art. So there's this great montage. I think you can even YouTube it. I think they've put this together, like this 10-minute montage of a scene where Tom Wolfe brings in like 3,000 pages of this massive manuscript, and he says. Sorry, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second so you can see all my hand gestures. So he brings in this massive manuscript, and they start to go through it page by page, line by line. And Tom or Colin Firth, who's the editor, continues to say like, well, you said this 6 pages ago, and I don't believe the way you're describing this character, and this is repetitive, and on and on. He just keeps giving these notes, but he allows Tom Wolfe to make the decision on what to take out or how to alter it. And it gets to the end of this montage, and they're just taking what used to be, 12 pages describing a character, and they pare it down into like these 4 lines. And there's a moment where Tom Wolfe says, but the words, I hate to lose the words. And that's the way I approached painting years ago, was like, I don't want to take out all this fun detail, right? I'm this huge fan of like Thomas Moran and Ivan Shishkin and Peter Monstead, who, when you look at their work, it's like they painted every leaf, every little pine cone on the tree or whatever. But the more you study it, the more you realize how simplified they did make that information, and how brilliant they were at choosing the moments of description. And so that movie to me was just watching a painter sort of come to a greater realization. The problem we have as painters is we don't have the relationship with editors. So we're left to ourselves in our studio, putting all this information on the canvas, and then trying to figure out, is it well balanced? Am I overstating in this area? Am I understating in another area? Am I balancing my edges, my value contrasts? Are my colors harmonizing? These are all questions. These are really, really complex questions that we're dealing with. And typically as artists, we're dealing with them by ourselves. So to me, a lot of the weaknesses that I might see in paintings, I don't attribute as much to the weakness of the artists particularly, but the weakness of our current culture as artists, which is we almost never get together to bounce these ideas off of each other, or to get that feedback from our peers. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to New York or Paris or Florence, and just, Boston, and walked into these studios and been like, oh my gosh, this other artist is like 10 minutes away. It must be such a nice resource to have them close. And they'll say, oh, I haven't seen him in 8 months. And I think, for me personally, I feel like I could be a better painter if I found that community, built that community, where I could get that critical feedback regularly. If you've read 19th century biographies, they talk about it all the time. They built in all the major cities in Europe, they built these townhouse rows typically that were specifically built for artist studios. And so a lot of these artists work next door to each other, and they would go to parties they didn't have Twitter or Instagram to distract them. They can sit at home for 6 hours on TikTok. And so they interacted a lot more. There's British artists said, we would make it a point to visit one another's studios a minimum of 3 to 4 times a week for the express purpose of critical review. And to me, when I go through museums, I feel like the paintings that I'm looking at, if you're looking at a Bouguereau or an Emile Friant or a Julien Dupré, I feel like they were done sort of by committee. I feel like the genius of the masters was not only that the individual genius, but the collective genius that made these paintings as masterful as they could be. And so for me, my wife and I have been talking, we're hopefully going to be moving this summer, sometime soon, but hopefully this summer. And my goal is to get back east, because there's so many artists, museums, whatever, that I'm hoping to kind of dive into a larger community, because I think I could be better. But I think the only way that I could be better is if I'm more inclusive and have more eyes looking at this stuff. And that includes the masters. There's a great biography by E.V. Lucas on Edwin Austin Abbey. It's a 2-volume set. I love that biography. It really puts you in that world. It talks about how Sargent and Edwin Austin Abbey they shared this huge studio in England when they were making the Boston Public Library murals. And it talks about how Wagner would come play music while they painted, and Whistler would pop in and talk about their work, and Alma Tadema would come down and criticize their work as they were doing it. They would cut out these big pieces of brown paper and put it on the background and completely repaint these huge backgrounds and say, what if you did it like this? It's like early Photoshop, right? But think about Edwin Austin Abbey, John Singer Sargent, Whistler, and Alma Tadema in the same room, thinking about the same idea and saying, what if you had this color in the background, or what if you treated the drapery like this? You know, that's not just Edwin Austin Abbey being a genius. Part of his genius is allowing that feedback and seeking it out. And so I think that that's really important. Okay, that's all sort of on a tangent, more philosophical stuff. So let's get back to the painting. Are there any questions about any of that? Nope. Okay. Let me do the screen share again. So again, here's the idea. And you know, when I was talking about Tom Wolfe, and I hate to lose the words, this to me was trying to specifically give myself an idea that put me in a position to say far less, and to make this, you know, basically like a 4-line poem where I could just make a very simple poetic statement. Again, high key, and still make it feel like nighttime with that moon reflection. So this is the jumping off point. I'm going to try to make 2 paintings of this. One of the things I don't like about this painting is the wave. I just hate how I treated that. The shape to me, you know, it sold, I think, you know, sometimes I'll send stuff to a gallery and then I'll look at it a month later and think, oh, there's that one piece. Like I didn't see it before, but now that I see it, I can't unsee it. And I wish I could get it back and change it. This one sold a little bit faster, but if I could have, I would have got this back from the gallery and just tweaked that wave a little bit to be more interesting. But, you know, once it's sold, you can't really do that. But that's one of the little irritants that makes me want to come back and readdress this concept. Can I do it better? I think I can do it better. The other thing that I don't like about some of the seascapes that I do, because this is all invented, so I don't have photo reference for this, but I sometimes make the vantage point a little bit high. And so it doesn't quite feel like from a viewer's standpoint that you're grounded. And I can show you more what I mean about that. Let me look up my, how do I do this? Let me just get to my website real quick and I'll show you exactly what I mean here. So this is an invented scene. And I just feel like I'm not quite standing on the ground here. It feels like I'm sort of hovering above this scene. Does that make sense? It's almost like a drone view. and I can't tell you why I did it that way. I think it's just basically the horizon is a little bit higher, and so that you know, from here to here being more stretched out, it feels like I have to have a higher vantage point in order to see down on all of that stuff. So what I've done with this new idea is and I feel like that's kind of, it's not as true of this, but I feel like it's still a little bit true. So what I want to do is kind of bring the horizon down closer to the waves and be looking more across the sea rather than a little bit further down. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is the jumping off point, and here's a couple of sketches. Really basic, just in my sketchbook, trying to kind of think through the problem. The reason to do these thumbnails is just to think through the basic composition. Most of the work will be done sort of on the fly, and I kind of like that fly by the seat of my pants thing with landscape painting, that freedom to kind of alter and change and shift. I feel like when I'm working from life, I always have a tendency to try to be more true to what I'm observing, almost from a student standpoint, just kind of copy what I see. And when I'm working from a photograph, if it's of a specific place, I feel like I have the same tendency to want to make it too close to the photograph. So invention is a way to say, all of that aside, all reference aside, what does the painting need? And I want to be aware of that, have that really strong, absolute awareness constantly in the front of my mind of asking myself, what does the painting need? Every single time I go to work on it, solving the problem for the painting rather than saying, well, this is what the reference is telling me. So here's the basic idea for one of them. And I think I'm going to do this one a little bit larger on a 24 by 30 canvas. And then here's the idea that's a little bit closer to the original. This one, I'm going to use reference for the sky. I was driving to CrossFit the other day, and let me see if I have that pulled up here. I don't. Oh, is that it? There it is. I was driving to CrossFit the other day and saw this. And it's just such a beautiful color harmony. Very, very different than that original painting, where I was trying to do a high-key moonlit seascape, but almost the same key. And so the problem I'm giving myself now, and my computer is about to run out of batteries. Sorry. Make sure that's plugged in. Okay, we're good. So the problem I'm giving myself with these two ideas, kind of doing them simultaneously, is can I paint both of them in around the same key and have one feel like it's evening, moonlit, and one feel like it's more sunset, that end of the day sunset, and do that just through the use of slight value shifts and color harmonies. And so that's kind of the direction I'm going. So this is the sky I'll be using for this composition. And then this second composition, I'm going to be taking off of that original for the basic color harmonies. I'm going to have just a much different seascape below it, and probably kind of change up the sky quite a bit as well. Okay, so having said that, I did these small, really quick color sketches. Let me stop sharing here. Let me minimize that. Nope. How do I take that away? Go away. Waiting room. Shoot, how do I do this? There we go. Okay. So I did this one yesterday as a color sketch for the moonlit painting. I am going to try and take it a little bit more to the blues. In this other painting, that original painting, let me go back to the screen share. You can see that some of these parts in the seascape are maybe a little bit more green. That would be, I would have used a little bit more Viridian in there. But I think that with this one, I like the harmonies pushed more to the blues and the violets. So, I mean, this is 40 minutes, maybe. This is a 9x12. I will work on this some more just to kind of clean it up, but I didn't think it would be necessary for me. This is how all my paintings look like when they start. The goal is to just get an overall sense of the oneness of the painting. So I don't paint my lightest lights. I don't paint my darkest darks. I kind of compress my values, and I get the average color for all of the major masses. And that seems to make the most sense in because what that does is it sets the stage for the rest of the painting. Because as you probably know, when you're working on an oil painting, it's not like a drawing. You can't, like, if I'm doing a figure drawing, for instance, I can work on the portrait and then jump down to the feet and then up to the chest area and then down to the hand and whatever. And it doesn't matter because it's all a dry medium. But when you're working on an oil painting, there's a lot of things that you want to resolve while the oil is wet. And so what that means is you have to kind of work in sections, right? So if I'm going to do this painting at 18 by 24. And the reason I'm doing it 18 by 24 is because I have a really nice frame already made for it. And I hate buying more frames. But at 18 by 24, it's going to take longer. It's going to take me more time to like resolve specific areas like the shape of the clouds in the sky or whatever. So you kind of have to work on those sectionally. You can't bounce around like you can with a dry medium. And the danger when you work sectionally is to think sectionally. And that's where you get this really piecemeal feel to your work, where you have these separate parts that are well done, but they don't quite mold together. Does that make sense? So by starting like this, I tie the entire painting together from the very beginning. So now when I start to work on smaller sections, I'm less likely to treat them as individualistically because I'm constantly mentally checking them against the rest of the information on the canvas. Does that make sense? And here's how that looks. In say a figure painting. Here's another thing I'm working on at the moment, and you can see like everything's pretty well laid in at the same level. Compressed values, overall color harmonies laid in, the major masses, I can kind of tell where I'm taking it. I might pump up a few areas in the cheek to be slightly more pink. I'll get more detail in the flowers. I'll just keep adding information in here, but as I add information, I have an overall blueprint for how everything's going to fit together. Does that make sense? Okay. The second painting, this is a 12 by 16. Again, just roughly laid in, pretty thinly. This is done mostly with straight paint or paint with mineral spirits. That's how I start all of my paintings. Very similar, and you can see how I'm trying to keep these value schemes about the same, and make one feel like night and one feel like the last light of day. See if I can pull it off. So I'll do this one a little bit larger at 24 by 30, and I'll do this one 18 by 24. I thought I'd kind of run this idea by you guys and see what you think. I'd like to make sure you're getting out of this what you kind of hoped for. But the idea was to start the 18 by 24 today. Actually, I could start either of them. Doesn't really matter. The 24 by 30. Right now, it looks like this. I started this painting of France on there, and I don't like it, so I'm gonna paint over this painting. So I'll have to work in layers on this. The first layer is not going to cover all of this. The second layer, I'll be able to cover it completely. but I can still get the basic idea down. Here where I had a bunch of green in the foreground, I put lead white over that just to kind of make it not so dark. So either way, the start of either of those paintings is really going to end up looking the same as this. You'll just get to see how I do that. So the idea was between sessions, I could start the second one since you'll already get an insight into how I do that. And then by next Saturday, that will be dry and I can start to get into the second layer of one and take it as far as I can in terms of resolving things. And then maybe finish that on the third Saturday, get into the next painting that same Saturday and finish the second one on the final Saturday. Does that sound all right as a goal for everyone?
Yeah.
Is there any questions about anything so far?
I had a question.
Yeah.
When you say that you're doing it from like you're inventing it and it's like from imagination and stuff, and you show like a reference photo that you would use, I think on the like the more like evening painting that you're going for, is it because you've seen like the sea so many times that you're able to pull that from your mind, or like how are you able to invent that?
Yeah, so landscape's a little bit easier than say figure. Like, I don't know if you've ever tried to invent a figure, but everybody knows when there's something off with a figure, right? I mean, you have to know anatomy inside and out. You have to know perspective. You have to know musculature. And landscape, it's a lot easier to kind of push back and forth. A lot of it's about interesting shape making, and that can be anything, right? What is the shape of a cloud? I mean, you can't really define the anatomy of a cloud in the same way. It's obviously you have to think about maybe wind patterns and atmosphere, and you know, you have to understand light. But ultimately, it's so malleable in terms of the shape, as long as you can make it feel like it has structure. When you studied waves, like I've done a lot of crappy paintings. That's really how I've done hundreds of crappy paintings where it didn't work. The best thing I can tell you is you cannot create something from nothing. Which might mean might be interpreted as I don't believe in the Big Bang, but I do. I don't mean it that way. It means that you can't pull from an empty reservoir. So one of the things that I used to do is like I would invent landscapes. Early on in my career, I would start to invent them because the plein air paintings I was doing were really boring. I was just kind of going out to figure something out, right? I would want to study atmosphere one day. I'd want to study clouds another day. I'd want to study the movement of water another day, but they weren't turning out into paintings, right? Because I wasn't really applying design sense to those. Those were more about just understanding something. And so once I started to do that, I started to realize, well, I need to start thinking compositionally, more thematically, with this, because nobody, I didn't even want to look at my plein air work. It was so boring. So how do I make a landscape painting from that? Well, I have to be willing to push and pull things around, to delete this rock or add a tree or whatever. So I started to invent landscape paintings because I wanted to be more design driven. And initially, it was also to try and prove what I knew about the landscape. Can I make this work? And I did a lot of crappy paintings, a lot. You know, waves that make no sense, and sunsets that, you know, totally defy the laws of light. And then when I run into problems, when I would like make a wave that looks stupid, I realized like, okay, there's something I don't understand about this. Let me go study that specifically. And then I would make these plein air sketches that were targeted and deliberate. And then when you really study those things, like I remember years ago, I was struggling with this sunset painting. I just didn't believe it. And it just smacked me in the face. Like, I've never actually painted sunsets from life. So of course I'm not going to know what it should look like. So I spent the next month and I went out like 4 nights a week, and I did, you can spend maybe 7 to 12 minutes on a sunset sketch before it changes a lot. So I'd have 5 small panels, and I would spend like 10 minutes, just rip out the color, put it down, get the next one. And then I was studying the changing colors really intensely. So then when I was doing like 5 a night, 20 a week. I had 80 at the end of the week. And so I had these stacks of collected studies for how the light changes, how different atmospheres affect that light. I had like how it looks like when it's popping through the clouds. I had all these different, this mountains of information. And so then bring it back in the studio and just messing with the shape making and cloud formation shapes. And, I can create like the shape of a tree. That's just freedom of shape making at that point. But the knowledge of atmosphere, the knowledge of color harmony, the knowledge of structure, that all comes from studying from life.
I've got it. So it's studying, and then you could reference some of your studies if you needed to, but most of it's memorization from having done it so many times.
Well, not all of it. I very rarely sell my plein air landscapes because they're just too valuable. So absolutely, when I'm doing a sunset painting, like when I did this original seascape that I'm kind of basing this off of, I had sketches that I had done from life of a sky that was similar. I had those right next to the easel. So I typically, again, I don't typically sell those just because they're too valuable, and I invent too much to give those away.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I use everything. I mean, like I've taken master paintings that I really loved, and let's say like William Trost Richards' Seascape, and I love the color harmonies, and so I'll make my own composition, but I'll copy his color into it just to figure out how he balanced it. And so another good thing, I have some friends that they have these like inspiration boards. Well, they'll have these printouts of, say they're working on a portrait or something. They'll have, 5 or 6 different artists that have a similar lighting treatment or maybe a brushwork or whatever. And they'll sit those next to the easel and they'll just glance over and let that kind of seep into their decision-making. So that's another great way is having masterworks up. Like you can't turn it off. Behind me, I have this iMac, and so typically, like I'll have the reference up there that I'm working from, but I have it on a 20-minute timer. So every 20 minutes, it goes to this slideshow of about 20,000 master paintings, and it'll stay there for an hour. And so that's been really important for me to have. I've done that for the last 15 years because, again, it takes the reference away. And that's really important for me to make that go away, because I'm not trying to make a 1-for-1 copy of it. I want to get back into the mindset of solving problems relative to the canvas that's in front of me. Every size, like going from a 12 by 16 to a 24 by 30 is not a direct translation. There's a lot more space you have to solve for. And so, you can't just take a small sketch of something and assume that every bit of that compositionally is going to work at a larger size. So you have to be willing to kind of adjust on the fly. So having that, go to master paintings is just a reminder of not only stop looking at your reference, but also here's the standard you're trying to get, right? Here's like master painting after master painting after master painting, going by the screen to remind me, like, don't get complacent. Keep make this as good as you can possibly make it. Because these guys weren't joking around. And that's a disease. The moment you let like this, it's good enough mentality get in your head, mediocrity is easy. Mediocrity is like the easiest way to go. And doing something truly your best is, man, that is a really hard discipline, not only to obtain, but to maintain. So, so anyways, that's been a good reminder for me. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. That's good. That's good. I've seen other landscape painters like reference something similar, talking about working from their imagination or inventing, but it's hard because everyone explains it a little bit differently. But that was a good explanation.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to find what works for you. You're really just trying to problem solve. Painting is all about problem solving. So when you run into an issue, it's because you're struggling with a solution in that specific area. So, a difficult discipline is to stop mid painting and say, I don't know, if you're doing like a moving stream or something, and you don't feel like you're getting the movement correct. Well, stop the painting and go out in the woods and find a stream and study that, and then you have these solutions you can bring back and apply, or look up like a Fritz Thalo who, painted water. So sometimes it's easier to understand how to do it when you see how somebody else did it. Then like, if you just go look at a moving stream, you could still be like, I don't know how the hell that translates to oil paint, but if you look at like great painters, and find and just kind of analyze that and try to reverse engineer it, then you can say, okay, here's how this still medium applies to this moving form, and here's how I can describe it in a way that feels natural.
Got it.
Does anybody else have any questions, doubts, concerns, fears? All right, let's jump in. I think for the sake of simplicity, it might be easier, just so you don't have to look past this thing that already has kind of something painted on it. If I just start with the blank surface and start laying in that painting first. Or would you guys want to see what it's like to paint over something else? Is there a preference there?
No preference.
No preference. No, everybody is opinionless on the subject.
I think I'd like to see both eventually.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just taking the little ridges off of this. As it dried, it had just a few small ridges.
I had a question, just in general, when you're sanding over, are you sanding over the one that you don't want to finish, or as a substrate for the new painting? Are you just sanding it over, or how do you treat that? Do you have to gesso that, or you just go straight?
Well, I laid it in oil, so I can't gesso over it. Because gesso is a water-based medium. So I laid this in relatively thinly, except the sky. I painted that pretty opaquely, but this is how it was. But I use lead white in it, and you have to be really careful about sanding lead. In fact, ideally you wouldn't sand it at all. just because it's, you know, once it gets airborne, it's really dangerous. Using it as a liquid medium, paint, whatever, you know, I know that there's a myth out there that, you know, it soaks into your skin and lead, blah, blah, blah. That's not true. Lead's very, very safe unless you eat it or inhale it. So if you're going to sand a surface that you've used lead on, either have a great respirator or and you know, I don't want to say do it outside because then you're spreading lead, you know, all over, but definitely have a great respirator and good ventilation. But the best way would be to wet sand it. That way, you know, you're minimizing the amount that gets airborne. But on this, I didn't use very much paint, so I still have mostly a linen texture. So if there was any subtle ridges or thicker paint, I just took my palette knife and scraped those down. And then on this dark area where I had green, I did thinly put some lead white. But I put it thinly enough where I still only have linen texture there. So this is thin enough where I can just pretty well paint over it.
Does the fat over lean rule apply if it's dry already? You know, there's that general rule, fat over lean. Once it's dry, it doesn't matter, does it? You can go with some mineral spirits and
it still does matter. Yeah,
Still
I mean, but this first layer I painted with either direct paint, and lead white paint is incredibly lean. It takes, has anyone made their own paint before? Anyone ground their own paint before? You might try it. It's fun. You know, get a mauler and a you know, piece of glass, thick piece of glass. You can get pigment from Natural Pigments if you wanted to, and linseed oil. And you'll notice that different pigments require different amounts of oil to become the consistency of paint. So like one of the reasons that, say, ivory black dries much slower is because it requires a lot more oil to get to that paint consistency than lead white. Lead white is the leanest of all of the paints. So this is a ton of lead white in here. So just as a mixture, it's very, very lean. And then on top of that, I added mineral spirits to just keep it a little bit more washy. So this layer of paint is super lean as it is. So I can go over the top of that pretty safely with direct paint, and it'll still be slightly more fatty than what's already on here. If you're painting over something that you painted pretty thickly, and you just want to reuse the canvas, then what I would suggest, yeah, you could sand it down a little bit, and what that's going to do is open up the paint. It's going to takes maybe some of the ridges off, but it's also going to open up the surface. And then maybe take some spike oil, which we talked about earlier. You can watch that. Spike oil being a much stronger solvent than mineral spirits, and wipe the whole canvas down with that. Let that dry, and then go back in over the top and paint on it again. Sometimes when you get, you know, a canvas that just has too much oil on it, just discard it and buy a new one. But this one I'll be safe painting over. So we've got about 45 minutes. Let's see how far we can get. You know, I'm going to start with this one just because. Okay, so with larger paintings like this, I want to make sure my paint color and value is consistent when I'm laying this in, and I'll get this other camera put up so you can actually see what I'm doing. But So what I'll do with a larger canvas like this, where I want it to be subtle, is I'll mix up a big pile of paint and maybe a couple of big piles of paint. When you have a surface like this that gradates really subtly, you want all of those colors to kind of grow out of the same color. You want them to harmonize really well. So even though this is kind of a more of a red, yellow sort of color, it comes from this. And I could do the opposite too. I could start here with that and then just start to add some Viridian and into the cobalt if I wanted to. Either way works. Typically with sunsets like this, I try to start with the cleanest color, because it gets dirtier as it comes here, right? There's, this is really just two colors. This is like Viridian, maybe a hint of that cobalt, and maybe like the tiniest bit of Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre. But that's about as clean a mixture as I'm going to get, besides this cobalt. So once I start to get down into here, I'm adding a little bit of yellow ochre. I'm getting into the orange molybdate. Now that starts to get a lot dirtier of a color. So it's more difficult to get this clean color out of this than it is to get this out of that. Does that make sense? And I'll show you how I kind of like go about that. The first layer, as you can see, it's a little bit more streaky. The paint is a little bit more transparent. It's not as controlled. It's a little bit messier. So that's how the first layer is going to start. You're going to see through to the surface. You're not going to have as subtle a gradation as you want, but that, so you're allowing for that to happen in the second or third layer. But I still want it to be consistent, so I'm going to pre-mix a large pile to pull from. And this is the one that I'm gonna kind of go off of for this larger painting. Let me go to this. So I'm gonna mix here, and you can see how I do that, and I get a bunch of paint on my hands. Is there any other questions while I'm doing this about anything, inventing or plein air or?
I've got a question, Ryan.
Yeah.
I've used Rublev's oil primer over top of paintings that I don't want. Is that safe? Is that would you do that?
I'm not sure. I don't know exactly what they use in the primer, and you could ask George that, or it might even say on the back of the can or something. My only hesitation is that they do use titanium in the primer, even though it's lead primer. The titanium gives it that extra brightness, that extra whiteness, and you've probably noticed that it's really liquidy, right? So for me, I've never done the primer over a painting. I typically just use that lead white #1 and thinly apply that. If I'm going to, like, that's what I did on this.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
This was a different painting.
Okay.
You can see it's kind of dark back there as a figure painting. And it was too dark. I had considered doing a landscape on this. But that's just lead white, not the primer.
Right. It's called lead primer. The lead is right in the name of it. So
yeah. So it's mostly lead, but it's also very thin. And I'm not sure what they mix it with to make it that thin.
Yeah.
So that's why I would probably ask them. That's just something I don't feel like I can answer.
Thanks
I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Just gonna pull out a ton of this You guys have all seen this now, so I just throw this to the side. It's going to be easier for me to mix this so you can see on a larger table. Trying to gauge how much paint I'm going to need. You know, always use more paint than you think you'll need, because if you are mixing subtle colors that you want to be consistent, and you don't mix enough and you get maybe halfway, 2/3 of the way done, and you have to remix to that subtle color, that can be really difficult. If you're really experienced, it may not be as difficult, but then it just gets annoying. You have to stop painting, mix another big pile, try to match that. So try to mix a larger pile than you think you'll need. Okay. I need a lot more paint than this. So the main colors I'm going to be using in the sky are cobalt to the Viridian, Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre into the orange molybdate. And then down in the ocean, I want to lay that in as well, loosely. That's going to be more into the, you can see this, ultramarine blue deep, but even this comes from this sky color here. It's an extension of that. So I want to mix up quite a large pile of that. And then even this is kind of an extension of this. This within these clouds, I'm adding a little bit more ultramarine blue deep, and then I want it to have a little hint of pink in it, so I'm adding some orange molybdate as well. And the pink I want is a warm pink, not a cool pink. That's why I would choose the orange molybdate versus the alizarin crimson. All right. So I'm going to start with the more cobalt here. Just because that's a very simple color. It really is straight lead white and cobalt. And lead white is a more subtle color. If you use titanium, this is one thing I noticed. I was working with artist Carlo Russo. If you know him, he's brilliant. But he used to use titanium. Maybe he still does. But when you use titanium, it's such a potent, has such a potent power to it, that what I would typically do is mix my two colors up. Let's say I'm doing flesh. I'll get a red and a yellow, and I'll mix that up. And then I'll slowly introduce the white. Because the white is so powerful, it can overrun those other colors pretty quickly. With lead white, it's a much more subtle color. So I start with a big pile of lead, and then I slowly bring color into it, because the colors have far more influence on the lead white than they would on titanium. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, and I want to keep this relatively high key. So I can't make this too dark. And the reality is, with color and value, that you can't simultaneously have high value and high saturation, high chroma. Those two things typically don't go together. The more chromatic something is, the more color saturation it has. And the closer you get to the color out of the tube. And typically most colors out of the tube are a much lower value, middle to low value. So the more saturation I put into my mixture, the lower the value tends to be. Also, if you use glazing, the reality is that all of your glazes will make something darker. So if I did at the end of this feel like I wanted to glaze it, I need to paint that a slightly higher value so that the glaze will have the proper effect. Otherwise the glaze may make it too dark. So anyways, I want to be careful not to add too much of the cobalt pigment to this. And you can see the difference in these two, right? This is a much higher key. This is a much more saturated cobalt. And there's a big difference between the values there. So I just don't want to add too much cobalt. But the other thing I have to think about with this one specifically is that if I want that brightness on the cloud to pop, which I do, because that's like really kind of the punch of the painting, then the values around it do need to be slightly darker. So this being the first layer, it's more transparent, so it's not as dark as I'll want it to be as I push it forward. So I'm going to try to enhance the amount of pop that brightness on the cloud has by lowering the increasing the saturation, slightly lowering the value. All right, just put a okay. If you have any questions, just shout them out.
So what color are you making right now? Is that the color for the sky that's really blue?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, right at the top against the clouds. So
Yeah.
this is the cleanest blue, and
They,
it's straight
yeah.
cobalt and white.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing I was going to say. So you can see on this painting that's already on here, I painted the sky around the clouds in that first layer. That's totally valid. You can create those shapes in this first layer if you'd like to. There's another option though that gives you a sort of way of backtracking, and I've started to use that a little bit more often. So that's kind of like what I'm doing here a little bit on this one. With this one, what I'll probably do is paint this whole sky just a soft gradation, try to get that slight glow around the moon, but paint basically no clouds, just a sort of flat surface. And the reason that I'll do that is because once it's dry, I can come in over the dry surface with a slightly lower value, and I can craft the shape of those clouds right on top of that dry surface. And you know, you might think, if you're painting over that dry surface, how do you control your edges, or how do you get it to sort of melt into the layer in front of it? Well, that's where that oil painting medium number 1 comes in, because it's viscous. It has like a tackiness to it, that it, like, say if I put a linseed oil on that surface and paint into it, it's super slick. It's not going to feel natural at all. This new layer over the dry layer is going to, you know, slip across this linseed oil surface. It's not going to be easy to work with at all. But the oil painting medium number 1 is sticky enough where it feels like you're painting into wet paint. So what I'll do is I'll put a very thin layer of that over a dry sky, and then I'll come in with the cloud color, and I can just really carefully craft these shapes on top of the dry surface and fold them into this previous layer, sort of control that edge through transparency. And what that allows me to do is then mess with the shape, because if I don't like it, I can just wipe it off, and then I have that really clean sky behind it, right? So if I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do with the cloud shapes, it's easier to get just paint the sky sort of a nice, really beautiful, even gradation, and then come back once it's dry and make those choices with the clouds. Again, because you have a way to backtrack. If you paint it wet into wet, it is what it is. It's a little bit harder to manipulate. In this case, I did, you know, lay those basic cloud shapes in all at the same time. So that's the way I'm going to do it here. I'm a little bit more certain about what I'm going to do with the clouds, so I'll just kind of integrate them all at the same time. Okay, so that's probably enough, but I also want to mix up a little bit of the gradation while I'm at it. Here on this surface. So this is going to fold into more of a green viridian as that comes down. Let me screen share this so you can see how I'm thinking. As that comes down from this more cobalt color, it kind of gets into a little bit more green. You can see this sort of yellow haze here. And so the cobalt, or I'm sorry, yeah, the cobalt going into that more yellow haze, that transitional color ends up being a little bit more of a viridian. So I'm going to start mixing once I get here to a little bit more viridian, and then start adding some of that bluish yellow ochre, very little yellow ochre, and then it starts getting into sort of this dirty pink, and that dirty pink is important because what you're looking at, the reason it's dirty is you're seeing a lot of like particulates in the air, right? And then you get up to the higher atmosphere where you have these pinks and they're more clean. And that juxtaposition of like a more clean pink against a dirtier pink really just adds this tangibility to that atmosphere. If you've ever seen like Albert Bierstadt or Thomas Moran, Frederick Church, they were amazing at it, you know, just phenomenal at playing those you know, slightly more muddy colors against the cleaner colors to get that atmosphere. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about as I'm getting these initial mixtures. You can see from that photo reference as well, that from a value standpoint, let me pull it up one more time real quick. From a value standpoint, it gets lighter. So the more saturated it is to the cobalt, if you were to turn that to a black and white image, it's darker up here. and it gets lighter, and it's lightest right there. And then as you get more color saturation into the red, it gets darker again. So you can kind of squint at that and see it a little bit. But, you know, one thing that is helpful, you know, some artists do this because we all have our phones, you know, typically all the time with us, is you can check your painting. You can even just check what you're looking at by turning on your phone's camera and turning it to black and white and just kind of viewing it through that. It might also be helpful if you have two reference photos, one that's the original and one that you've turned to black and white. If you're struggling with value, that might be a useful tool to help you as a reminder. Okay, I'm going to just start there, and the rest of it. Well, let me mix what the transitional color will be. It'll be easier to see it if I do this here. Can you see that all right? Is there too much glare? Uh-oh. What happened?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of glare for me.
What happened?
There's quite a bit of glare. What would happen? What would happen if you closed your window, the drapes on your window a little bit?
Let me try to get a slightly different angle here. Is that a little bit better?
Oh, I thought you meant the painting, because the painting.
Oh,
is-
the painting, I'll move the camera. Once I'm done with this
Okay,
mixture,
great, okay.
I'll move that so you can see the painting a lot better.
Your palette was just fine before, but I think this is better, actually.
Okay.
Sorry.
So then I'm into a little bit of Viridian. Into some of this orange molybdate. Orange molybdate is really powerful, so I don't need much of that. But the dirtiness kind of comes in from the yellow and the green. That kind of grays down the red a little bit. Obviously, green being the complement, I'm going to get a little bit more a natural haze out of that.
Ryan, which pile is orange molybdate on your
This-
oh, I see. Okay,
Yeah, it's a very warm, vibrant red.
it is. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure why they call it orange. I mean, that's just the name of the pigment. But really its use is for warm reds. Okay, so there's going to be obviously a transition between all of these colors, but here's the main, general colors. And again, knowing that this is the first layer, it doesn't have to be totally perfect. I just need to get something on the painting so that I can really judge it, It's hard to judge something on the palette. It's hard to, it really doesn't matter what it looks like on the palette. It matters what it looks like on the surface. So I do want to always come up here and put a little tester down before I dive too far into it. So if I feel like I can change the larger pile, and in a positive way, then I can do that. To me, that's a little too red. It's a little bit more red than I want. So I'm going to add a little bit more of the Viridian to kind of knock that red down. But again, I'm adding pigment here, so I'm also lowering the value. So I want to offset that by adding a little bit of white back into it. warm it up a little bit because the Viridian's super cool. So I'll warm up a little bit with the yellow ochre. And I have a little bit more dead color here, which will be more atmospheric. All right. I'm going to transfer all of this over to my handheld palette and move this this one so you guys can see a little bit better the painting. Any questions while I'm just transferring this stuff?
Well, I'm trying to think about, what you're doing there is mixing on one palette and then using a handheld with those piles. And, I can think of a couple of advantages. Why do you think that works for you?
I only did it for filming purposes.
Oh,
I
Oh.
thought it would be easier for you guys to see
okay,
if I mixed on that flat surface.
okay,
Otherwise, I just would have done it on the handheld palette.
okay.
Actually, this is the handheld palette is what I've been working on recently. And so I actually had to like clean it, transfer it all over to the flat surface just for the purposes of filming it. But if it were just me, I would have just stuck with the handheld.
Okay, thanks.
Now that I've got my studio in my home, I get to like work in my slippers, and I just realized I've never taught a workshop in my slippers before. Kind of nice. All right. This big pile over here. So I'll make sure I show you kind of how these fold in and out of each other as I move down the surface. But these are going to be the main piles that tie the whole painting together. I want them all to, if I was working on a smaller surface, I probably would have only mixed up a big pile of the cobalt. Because like say on the 9x12 or this 12x16, it's not a big area to cover. So if I'm using a medium-sized brush, then I would just, and this is what I did, I used one brush. I just lay in the cobalt, and then I use that same pile, and with the same brush, I push it to the Viridian, and then I lay that in and push it to the yellow, lay that in, all coming from the same brush, same pile. And it just has this string that goes from cobalt. I mean, the palette looks like the painting. It's a string from cobalt to Viridian to Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre to the orange molybdate, and it's just, it all comes from one source. The reason I'm doing it with 3 main sources, one is just to show you, the other is because it's a much larger surface to cover. So it would be difficult to make this much paint with just a brush, so it's easier to do with a palette knife. The one thing I didn't do was mix up something for this, the ocean color, and that is something I do want to lay in at the same time so I can judge those colors and values off of each other. So just lastly, and I can just do this here, you can see I'm just going to take kind of the same idea of mixtures. Start with the white. And I'll get a little bit of that cobalt in there again, because that's kind of how I started with this sky color. So I want to make sure that it's consistent with the that color that kind of harmonizes everything. And then this Blue Ridge, or I'm sorry, Ultramarine Blue Deep is going to darken that quite a bit. And then I want some of the Viridian also to influence that, but not too much, because like I said, on that original painting that I showed, I felt like I did like it, but again, you know, as I analyze and overanalyze myself later, I felt like maybe I could have left a little bit of green out of the sea and enhanced the harmony just like that little bit more. So I don't want to overdo this Viridian here, but again, it's the first layer, so harmony is the key. The most important thing is to establish an overall unifying effect. You know, I say it's the same lesson as, I mean, this could be a civic lesson as well, right? The way that you see value, the way that you see color is all relative. So here's a really good lesson in value and color. In 2011, we had a workshop here at my school where we had teachers from the Florence Academy, the Angel Academy, and the Grand Central Academy come, and we all painted together for a month. I wanted to expose my students to these slightly different working methods of various schools. And so my friend from the Florence Academy came, and at the Florence Academy, you're taught that light is the priority, that all else is subordinate to the lightest light, right? So I had hired a platinum blonde model with incredibly fair skin, and I designed this and had made this like $600 white lace dress. And so I had this whole idea of this really fair-skinned girl in a really a beautiful lace white dress. And I'm thinking about the Abbott Henderson Thayer painting in the National Portrait Gallery of the young girl with the wings, if you've seen that painting. And in that painting, it's amazing if you get to see it in person. It's in Washington, D.C. There's this décolleté of her upper chest, and then this white dress, and there's absolutely no line, no drawn line between the two. And you have to kind of get up close to the painting to really see how totally no edge to that. There's absolutely no edge. It's just that one melts into the other. And you take a couple of steps back and it separates. And the reason it separates is purely temperature, has no value separation. It's only temperature. This is the slightest temperature shift. It's really amazing. So that's what's in my head is like, I want to paint, I want to learn to paint flesh with less. And so I'm immediately going into this painting, looking for the similarities between the value and color of this model's chest and the dress. So that's how I'm painting it. And then I look over to my friend who's painting like what looks immediately like a sunburned model. The flesh was really red. much lower value than the dress. And I just thought, like, I studied with this guy. I know he's a great painter. Why would he do that? It just doesn't make any sense. And then I went and looked at it, and I looked back and forth from the painting to the model, and I realized he was right, that he was trying to emphasize the white of the dress. And so he was looking for how different the flesh was than the dress. And the truth is that both things were correct, that the way he was seeing it based on his mental assessment was true, and the way I was assessing it was true as well. So the truth is that you can see what you want to see, whether that is similarities or differences. And in this case, I really want to see the similarities. I want the unity. So as I'm mixing these colors, the most important thing for me to get and establish right from the very beginning is how these things harmonize, because then I'll be able to retain that. Then by compressing it, I can start to add subtle variations to it. And I'm less likely to add too much variation where it tears apart the whole harmony and statement. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah, that makes sense, Ryan, but how do those other schools differ from each other? Like, you started to talk about that, but you didn't finish.
Yeah, there's a lot of subtle ways.
Okay, so maybe for another day.
Yeah, it's really kind of inconsequential. I would say that the Grand Central is a lot more. Grand Central and Angel Academies are a lot more methodical. They have like a really distinct step 1, step 2, step 3 process of solving problems in paint. And I do feel like that helps students learn faster, but I have also seen that it breeds out an individuality in the artists that study there. You leave those schools and it's like you don't know how to solve problems in the way that you would solve them, because you never went through this clumsy process of like how do I want to describe a tree? What's more aesthetically pleasing, and how I would paint a wave or a portrait.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that.
I would say the Florence Academy is a little bit more fluid. I would say they allow for a little bit more freedom of expression. But the pitfall of all of them, and this is actually a damning quality to all of them, is they never talk about design and they never talk about aesthetic. They never have a discussion about why people are studying. So there's never a discussion about the post application of these skills they're developing. And what I've seen in like the last 25 years is the outcome of that is that the students tend to adopt the study as the art. So they leave the school and they end up doing a lot more like single head portraits or shadow box still lives, or like they not only are locked to the method, they're also locked to the student aesthetic. They were never talked to about ideas or concept development, or how to use different tools like Photoshop or photography, or narrative, or any of that. So I think that's ultimately, if it doesn't change, then I feel like the danger is that they could make themselves obsolete, because although like in 2005, it was amazing to see like this high level of skill again. But in 2023, we've seen it now for 15 years, and a lot of people can do it now. So if they don't figure out individually as artists what they want to say, why are they trying to make art in the first place, then we're left with really well executed, uninteresting works. And I think that's a real danger, and I don't have a solution for it. For me, I tried to encourage my students constantly to be working on their own stuff outside of class. because when you do that, that's what the art is. Being an artist is having a problem, and the problem is your idea. I have an idea to paint a girl under a tree reading. There's the problem. Now you have to figure out how to execute that. You have to figure out what tools am I going to use to execute this? Am I going to do it all from life? Am I going to do it all from photography? What do I want the girl to be wearing? What kind of light do I want? What kind of tree do I want in the background? How does it all lend itself to the overall narrative? I have to figure out how to put that all together. What size do I want to paint it? How am I going to frame it in the end? What's the purpose? Where am I going to show it? What's the audience? Those are all things that if you avoid doing them, you're not developing all of that artistic, necessary way of thinking. And so what do you do when you leave school? You set up another still life and you paint that because you're comfortable with that. And so I think painting your own paintings and making a lot of crappy work and figuring out why it's crappy and improving and improving and improving, it forces you to kind of go through that clumsy phase of self-discovery, of figuring out what it is that you like and how you like to describe things and what works for you aesthetically. It's a completely different motivation to solve problems from a certain aesthetic than it is to solve problems from just trying to make something look correct, whatever, version of correct you think works for you. Does that make sense?
It does. And thank you so much for saying that.
Okay, finally got these piles mixed up. All right, so I'm gonna grab this big brush. Let me move this camera so that you can see this better. All right, so that should have a lot less glare. Get a little bit closer here. All right. Is that good? You see that well enough?
I think that's good for day one, and you'll see how it works from there.
All right. I'm gonna sit here, so hopefully you can kind of see a little bit over my shoulder here as well. Trying to get this from. I know that's not perfect there at the top, but you can see the study in that one and kind of see how I'm going back and forth. All right, so I'm just gonna, I'm not gonna really draw this out too much. Because I can just create these, almost knock my computer over. Each brush is a little closer. I've got some kind of, older ratty brushes. Just gonna scrub this in. Shout out some questions if you have them. The only thing I'm really going to draw in, kind of, is the placement of this horizon. And with this one, I do want to put more emphasis on the sky. It's over. I don't want to lay that in too much because as I get down here with this lighter color, I don't want that darker color to mess it up. So I'm changing my mind. I'm gonna lay that in with that sky color here. I just need to know the basic placement of that. I typically think I'm putting it too low, and I always nudge it up a little bit, and then I end up with too much foreground. So, and I think that's why, you know, as I was talking earlier about my horizon line, how I feel like I kind of have the viewer at a higher angle. I think that's why. I think it's because when I first start, I overguess my horizon. I put it too high. So we'll lower that. And then with a painting this big, when I get to the second layer, just to make sure, I'll take a ruler and I'll measure, you know, a spot there and a spot over here, just to make sure that I get my horizon perfectly horizontal. Otherwise it'll look a little wonky. All right. So with this, I can just kind of paint through the, you know, where the clouds are going to be. That still work. Let's see if again, I'm not trying for perfect coverage here. You can see that I'm going to have a little bit of that background popping through, but I'll try to cover that pretty well. But I know I'm going to have to do a second layer, so it doesn't have to be perfect. How much time we got? What time is it? Oh, we're past time. All right. So does anybody, if you want to stay with me, stay with me. I'll just keep going for like a half hour. If that's okay. I'm sorry we're going to overtime, but I do want to get this first painting laid in. And for those that have to leave,
I'm okay. I'll stay.
for those that have to leave, it'll be recorded. So you can come back and check this out, maybe speed it up, watch it at double time or something, get through it faster. I'm adding a little bit of mineral spirits just to make it lay down a little bit easier. I also want to be careful not to make it too thick or textured, I guess. I'm more interested in the texture than the thickness. So the brushwork that I'm using, you know, I'm going to typically be moving kind of in one direction, just because I always think about like how it's going to be lit in a gallery or in a home. It's typically kind of lit from above. And so I don't paint super thick as it is, but with something like as subtle as the sky, I want to have less texture in that than I would say in like a foreground grass, or like once I get to the waves, that's where I want the texture, because that light hitting it is going to kind of bounce off all those little high points, and the texture will actually help make the waves look a little bit more foamy. But I don't want that random texture to take away from the simplicity of the sky. I really want the subtlety of the gradation to speak a little bit louder. So I want to minimize the amount of texture on the surface. Okay, so now I'm kind of going from this blue, and you can see maybe, which, okay, you can see how I'm kind of taking from this to get that first transition into the green. Using the same brush, that'll give me a much better transition. I do want to think about this, this cloud a little bit. So my thought was, after I did this color study, that maybe it was a little central. So my plan was to kind of push it over a little bit. I also wasn't totally sold on the shape. I felt like it looked a little bit too much like a ice cream cone scoop or something. So I want to make that a little bit more organic and stretch it out a little bit. That to bring a little bit more asymmetry into it, to make it a little bit more interesting. And I can do that on this larger surface, versus the smaller painting. You know, there's just not quite as much space. I mean, I can do the same thing on both, but on the larger painting, I think it works better to have it a little bit more stretched out. So just as a kind of guide, I'll rough that in. So I'm going to start bringing in just a little bit of yellow ochre here. We'll get into that yellow haze pretty quickly. Get a little more yellow, and I'm going to dip slightly into this red.
Ryan, I can't exactly see the color, but you're going into the orange molybdenate color now.
Yeah, so I'm getting pretty well into this mixture
Mhm.
that is a combination of orange molybdate, viridian, and yellow ochre.
Right.
Leaning a little bit more to the red, but subtle, and the green dirties it up, just so that it feels like a haze rather than, the photo is taken in winter in Utah. But we have a slight inversion here that, when it's like this, it was a light inversion. It mimics humidity. And so I want to, this being a seascape, it works perfect to have that feeling of sort of hazy humidity over the ocean.
I was just realizing you have a second camera, which the colors are more visible on that, not as washed out. So if,
Yeah, this is a little bit more glary on the
Yeah.
top, and
Yeah.
this one,
if people don't realize, you can just double click on his second camera from the right side, and you can see the colors better.
yeah. So I'll probably, as I'm laying this down, it's a little less chromatic than my original study. And again, that's okay. This isn't meant to be like a perfect finished layer. It's meant to set the stage and give me an overview, an idea of where I'm headed. So also, because I'm painting over something, I need to cover that. So there's kind of multiple purposes here. But with the second layer, that's where I'm going to be a lot more careful and definitive with how I lay the paint down, the exacting colors that I want. But this is a really good first pass. One of the things that I don't have yet is it starts to get just a hint of purple as it comes down here, a little bit more blue influence, which I want, because in this one, you can see the separation between that and this is pretty distinct, and I'd like to kind of bring that a little bit closer together, soften it out a little bit. So as I come down to that horizon line, I'm going to add a little bit of this pre-mixed sea color to make that transition softer. And that's going to add a feeling of heavier humidity in the air. All right, so just right here at that bottom, I'm going to add a little bit of that. It's probably too much. Bring it back to the red just a bit. I want it to be too separate. Okay, and then just a quick measurement here. So I can get that pretty close. Straight across. Okay, from that, I can come in and I'm going to take this same mixture, just use that paint, add a little bit of ultramarine blue deep to that. And then I don't want it to be too blue. I want a hint of red in it, but I want it to be a warm red. Pop that back in. And then I don't want that to be as dark as that because I'm dealing with these clouds. So I want to make sure the shadow in my clouds isn't too dark. And I'm just going to rough this in. Again, I'm going to in this next layer, I'm going to be a lot more careful with the shape making and edge work, but just to get the basic idea down. Just for some context, again, just to rough this in. So I'm thinking about how this is going to make my next layer easier. So this is really just prep work to come in and do careful work. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It's like the first draft of an essay, right? I'm just I want to just get the idea down. And then I can clean it up later, as long as the ideas, the statement is consistent. Let me get it out on the page and then I can run a fine-tooth comb through it later. And I can see, like, you know, I'm adding the white, the lightness of this cloud, and it's really not popping the way I'd wanted it to. So that's good. That doesn't mean I laid this first layer in incorrectly. It just means that there I have my answer for the second layer. I need to have these colors be a bit more saturated so that this will pop off a little bit more. And I can address that the next layer. Okay, and I'll take this same brush. And get into this color. And I'm looking at my my color study, and I'm noticing that the color of, let me try to get it on here. The color of the ocean is a little bit grayer than what I have mixed on my palette. And I like the grayness to it. It doesn't, the color on my palette is a little bit more chromatic to the blue. So I'm going to add its complement, a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, just to kind of gray that down. And the color that's already on my brush is this. So inevitably that's going to influence it a little bit as well. It's a little bit dark, so I'm going to just thin it out a bit. And I don't mind the dark because, again, I'm going to come back in with these successive layers. And one of the things I'm going to add is a bit of sky reflection. So I can use the darker note that I've laid on first here as maybe the shadow side of the wave, or the shadow side of, and then add reflective qualities that lighten up the overall thing a little bit. Here I just want to kind of suggest the angle of composition. These waves are coming in at a slight angle. I'm imagining a little bit more East Coast waves that the waves aren't quite as big sometimes. Just those really kind of flat sea waves that are rolling in one after the other, really close together, kind of overlapping. Add a little bit of the sap green as I get closer to warm that up a little, because that tends to, especially when you see the waves as they're cresting, you get a little bit of that hint of green in there. So the exact design of this is not hyper important at the moment, as long as the basic design is there, which I already worked out in the color study in the little drawing. So if I can just get these major masses put in, careful handling of it will come later. Take this same color mixture as I just had for the light on the things on the cloud, and mix it as well. Basically, I'm going to mix this kind of color, and I'm going to use that as the foam on the waves. I like to do it roughly like this also because the abstraction is something I can kind of follow. Sometimes it creates these patterns or shapes that are interesting, and I can use as a jumping off point to design the rest of it. So especially when I'm not 100% certain where I'm going with it, or, you know, the exact shape of a wave I want to create or whatever, just kind of roughing it in, following the general lines of composition makes things easier in the next layer. Anybody still with me? All right. Sorry I went over. Just give me, if you got another 10 minutes, I think I can wrap up this lay-in. All right. And then the foreground, you're starting to get a little bit of the sand coming through in that front area that where the water gets really shallow, or even, you know, the wave has gone back out, and so what you're seeing here is just wet sand. So I added a little bit of asphaltum to that for the brown, and some yellow ochre to keep it a little bit more towards the yellow. And this is the wet sand there in front. Just for context, I want to make sure I add a little bit of dry sand in front of that. So I'm going to take that same sand color, lighten it up, add a little bit more yellow. But again, all these colors come from the same source, the same, you know, color harmony. So they're tied together. They feel like they have the same light hitting it. That's about it. The last thing I'll do is I talked about controlling the surface. Especially here, I don't want texture to detract when the viewer sees it. I sold a painting once to a collector early in my career. And the sky was, you know, well painted and simple, but there was one stroke on a cloud that went horizontally. It's a little bit thicker, and he sent the painting back and said, that's distracting. The way I have it lit in my house is distracting. Can you fix it? And I was young, and you know, I wasn't very good. So it actually took a lot of effort to fix that one little thing. But by the time I sent it back to him, he's like, "Oh, I changed my mind. I don't want it anymore," and asked for a refund. It was devastating at the time. But it was a good lesson to know like how the light hits the painting surface matters, and even like a random stroke unintentionally can distract based on how the painting is lit. So it's something I want to pay attention to. So lastly, I'm just going to grab a kind of a larger soft brush, one of these mongoose brushes. You can use like a sable or any soft large brush. You could make it bigger than this. I'm just going to really lightly go over this in areas that, like I roughed this in horizontally, this area up here. So I'm just going to kind of soften that out. Just as a final way to control my surface. Whatever texture I have at the end of the painting, I want to be deliberately placed. So this is just a way for me to have that extra level of control. It's going to make the next layer easier as well, because I won't be, I won't have to come back and scrape a bunch of random stuff down. Or paint over these random textures. So just the whole thing doesn't need it. And you have to be careful if you're doing this on a really fine surface, super fine linen, or if you're painting straight to like an ACM panel or something, it can almost polish the paint. It almost kind of burnishes it in a way. So it makes it a little too glassy. So I can do this on this because I'm using, it's not a rough canvas, but it's not the finest weave canvas. So it's not going to have that effect of burnishing the paint. So anywhere that I see just these strokes that might be a bit distracting. I'm using a super light touch here. Want to be careful as I get to this, because if I pick up that, a little bit of that dark color, it's going to pop right up into this lighter color. So I want to be careful about that. Here I can just. Super light, so that being horizontal is not going to negatively affect it. Most of the stuff down here, a lot of the strokes I may put on in later layers might be horizontal through here, but that's okay because I want the light to hit that. Some of these foamy areas are going to be a lot more thick, so it's totally fine to keep those horizontal. That's it. That's I mean, the basic start to the painting. You can't hardly see that in this one, but hopefully you can see it pretty well in this camera to get an idea of how that's started. Is there any final questions?
On the
I really enjoyed that. I got a lot out of it.
Good. Yeah, go ahead.
the blending that you did now, that's just sort of a first pass, and then you'll come in and smooth it even more on the next layer, right? Is that
It depends on what you mean by blending.
So where you're knocking down the horizontals with this blender brush.
Yeah, it wasn't as much to blend the colors together as it
Yeah,
was
just
just
to
kind of
knock
knock down the texture of the
Yeah,
paint.
yeah. Okay.
In another layer, if I'm struggling with, say, a gradation like this, because those can be really, really subtle. I may, if I'm struggling to get those edges to really like fold into each other, instead of looking kind of stripy, then I may get a softer brush like this and try. That's where I would actually try to blend those edges together. But for this purpose, it was just about surface control.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other final questions? All right. Well, thanks for hanging out with me. And
Thank you.
I'll get this up. I am technically challenged, so this has been recording, but I will try to get it up as soon as possible so you guys can access it. I know some of you missed a little bit of the first part of where we were talking about materials, so I will try to get that up as soon as possible and get you a link so you can access it.
All
Thanks
right,
so much.
thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, and I will see you guys next week.
Great.
All right.
Ryan,
Thank you.
would you recommend that we kind of, would you recommend that we try and do a version of this ourselves, and so that we're ready for you next week?
Sorry, say that one more time.
Would you recommend that we try a version of this ourselves and so that we're ready for, and it's dry for next week and carry on like that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it depends. This workshop is more about like watching. So I'm not,
I know,
going
yeah,
to be doing
Yeah.
feedback, but if you want to follow along, then yeah, like you can even use, if you want to screenshot any of those images I pulled up,
yeah,
use those as a kind of takeoff for a composition, by all means. Yeah, go ahead and do
okay,
that.
great.
Yeah.
All right, yeah,
All right. Well, thank
Yeah.
you all. Have
you.
a great rest of the day, and I will see you next
Yeah.
week.
all right,
Hi, thank you.
Yep.
bye.
Bye.